Breaking news in the Lily and Jack Sullivan case. Just a moment ago, sources close to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have confirmed that a shocking arrest is imminent in this case that has captivated the nation for 7 long, grueling months. But this isn't the arrest that everyone has been expecting. For months, the public has looked toward the inner circle, but investigators have uncovered evidence pointing to involvement by someone completely unexpected. Someone whose name has barely been mentioned in connection with this case until now. Darren Geddes, a man with connections to both Daniel Martel and Mala Brooks-Murray, is now at the center of explosive new revelations that could change everything we thought we knew about what happened to 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan on May 2nd, 2025. The evidence that emerged in the past 48 hours is absolutely shocking and suggests this case may be even more complex and disturbing than anyone imagined. Who is Darren Geddes? And why are investigators suddenly focused on him? What evidence has emerged that points to his involvement in the disappearance and presumed deaths of these 2 innocent children? And how does this new information fit with everything else we know about this case? The answers to these questions will shock you and demonstrate that the investigation into what happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan is far from over. In fact, it may be entering its most critical and revealing phase yet. Before we reveal the shocking details about Darren Geddes and why he's about to be arrested in connection with this case, you absolutely must subscribe to True Crime Vault right now and smash that notification bell. We've been covering the Sullivan case from day one with exclusive information and in-depth analysis you won't find anywhere else. This breaking news about Darren Geddes is developing rapidly, and if you want to stay informed as new details emerge and this case moves toward justice, you need to subscribe immediately. Hit that like button because it helps push this critical breaking news to more people who care about finding answers for Lily and Jack Sullivan. And please drop your thoughts in the comments section as we go through this information. Did you see this twist coming? What do you think Darren Geddes' role was in what happened to these children? Let's discuss this together as a community demanding justice and accountability. Now, let's examine who Darren Geddes is and what evidence has led investigators to focus on him with such intensity. Darren Geddes is a 34-year-old man who lives approximately 15 kilometers from the Sullivan property in Pictou County, Nova Scotia. Until this week, his name had barely been mentioned in media coverage of the case. He wasn't someone investigators publicly identified as a person of interest in their press conferences or public statements. He wasn't someone whose photo appeared in news reports about the ongoing investigation into the missing children. He seemed to be completely peripheral to the case, just another resident of this small, tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone and news travels fast through informal networks. But investigators have been quietly building a case against him for months, conducting surveillance operations, analyzing phone records and cell tower data, collecting physical evidence, interviewing witnesses, and that case is now complete and ready for prosecution. Sources close to the investigation indicate that an arrest warrant has been prepared, reviewed by prosecutors, and signed by a judge and will be executed within hours, possibly before this video is even finished uploading and going live. So, who exactly is Darren Geddes, and what is his connection to this tragic case that has devastated a community and captured national attention? Investigators have established through extensive interviews and analysis of records that Geddes has known Daniel Martel for approximately 6 years. They met through work in the construction industry, both doing construction and manual labor jobs in the Pictou County area, where employment opportunities in that field are common, but often sporadic and unpredictable. They weren't best friends who spent all their time together or who were inseparable, but they were friendly enough to socialize occasionally outside of work. They would have beers together after work, sometimes at local establishments. They helped each other out with odd jobs when one needed assistance with a project or when work was slow. Daniel considered Geddes someone he could trust with sensitive matters, someone who wouldn't ask too many probing questions about things that seemed unusual, someone who valued loyalty and discretion. And that trust, that sense that Geddes could be relied upon to keep his mouth shut and help when needed without judgment, may have led Daniel to involve Geddes in covering up the murders of Lily and Jack Sullivan. Here's what investigators have uncovered through painstaking, methodical analysis of phone records and cell tower data over months of investigation. Cell phone records obtained through legal warrants show that Daniel Martel called Darren Geddes at 11:32 p.m. on the night of May 1st, 2025. This timing is critically significant because this is just before Daniel made his trip to the gas station that was captured on security cameras at 11:47 p.m. The call between Daniel and Geddes lasted 7 minutes, according to the detailed phone company records that investigators obtained through proper legal channels. What was discussed during that 7-minute call in the middle of the night when most people are sleeping? Investigators believe, based on the timing and context, that Daniel was calling to ask for help, to bring Geddes into plan for disposing of the children's bodies, to coordinate what would happen in the early morning hours, to ensure Geddes would be ready and available when called upon to assist with this terrible task. Then, crucially and damningly, there's another call from Daniel to Geddes at 5:15 a.m. on May 2nd. This is right before Daniel took his truck to the wooded area, where it was spotted by the delivery driver at 5:45 a.m. This second call lasted only 2 minutes, according to the detailed records. Investigators believe this was Daniel telling Geddes where exactly to meet him, providing final instructions and directions, coordinating their movements precisely for the disposal operation that was about to occur in the early morning darkness, when few people would be out and about to witness what they were doing. But the most damning and conclusive evidence comes from what happened after that second call: cell phone tower data, which tracks which cellular towers a phone connects to as it moves through an area and provides location information that could be extremely precise, shows that Geddes' phone was moving from his home address starting at 5:20 a.m. on May 2nd, just minutes after receiving that call from Daniel. The route his phone traveled, based on which towers it sequentially pinged and connected to as he drove, corresponds exactly to roads leading toward the same wooded area where Daniel's truck was spotted by the delivery driver. Geddes' phone reached that general area at approximately 5:35 a.m. and remained in the immediate vicinity until 6:05 a.m. This means Geddes was in that specific location at the exact same time as Daniel, during the exact time window when investigators believe the bodies could have been disposed of and buried or concealed in the rough terrain. This isn't coincidence. This is coordination. This is two people working together deliberately to commit a serious crime. And this makes Darren Geddes an accessory to murder at absolute minimum, possibly even more depending on the full extent of his involvement and whether he was involved in planning stages before the children were actually harmed. But there's significantly more evidence beyond just the phone records and cell tower data. Investigators executed a search warrant on Geddes' home and vehicles 3 weeks ago. That search was conducted quietly without media attention or public announcement, which is why this information is breaking news now and catching people by surprise. What they found during that methodical search provides additional concrete physical evidence of his involvement in this case. First, they found a shovel in Geddes' truck that showed clear signs of recent use. The shovel had soil caked on it, dried, but still adhering to the metal surface. That soil was carefully collected using proper forensic procedures, preserved in evidence bags, and sent for comprehensive laboratory analysis. Laboratory testing revealed that the soil composition matches soil samples from the wooded area where Daniel's truck was spotted, the same area where investigators believe the bodies may be buried or concealed. The soil has specific identifiable characteristics, including specific mineral content, particle size distribution, clay composition, and organic material composition that make it distinguishable from soil in other areas of the county. Forensic soil experts who analyze the samples say the match is not just close or similar, it's conclusive and definitive. Geddes' shovel had been used to dig in that specific wooded area, and there's no innocent explanation for why a shovel would have soil from that location. Second, they found work gloves in Geddes' truck that became subject of intense forensic scrutiny. These gloves tested positive for traces of human DNA when examined using sensitive testing methods. The DNA testing is still being completed and confirmed through additional analysis and verification, but preliminary results suggest the DNA may belong to one or both of the Sullivan children. If that's confirmed through final testing and peer review, it would be absolutely devastating evidence that Geddes had direct physical contact with the bodies of these children, that he touched them, moved them, handled them in the process of disposing of them. Third, investigators found text messages on Geddes' phone that it attempted to delete, but that forensic specialists were able to recover using specialized software and techniques that can retrieve deleted data from phone memory. These messages, sent in the days after May 2nd, showed Geddes expressing significant anxiety and fear about being caught and facing consequences. In one message to a friend, he wrote something to the effect of, "I did something I shouldn't have done, and I'm scared it's going to come back on me." When the friend asked what he meant and pressed for details about what was troubling him, Geddes wouldn't elaborate or explain, just said he couldn't talk about it, and forget he said anything and not to ask again. In another recovered message, this one to Daniel Martel sent on May 5th, just 3 days after children were reported missing and searches were intensifying, Geddes wrote, "You said this would be simple and no one would know, but they're searching everywhere and I'm freaking out." Daniel's response, also recovered from the phones through forensic analysis, was, "Stay calm. Stick to the plan. Don't talk to anyone about anything. This will blow over." These messages demonstrate clearly that Geddes knew he had done something wrong, something criminal, something he could face serious consequences for if discovered. They showed direct coordination and communication between Geddes and Daniel, and they show Geddes was involved in something related to the extensive searches that were happening for the missing children, something he was afraid would be discovered if investigators looked too closely. But perhaps the most significant piece of evidence comes from a witness who has recently come forward to investigators after months of internal struggle about whether to get involved. This witness, whose identity is being carefully protected for safety reasons and to encourage others to come forward with information, was in the wooded area on the morning of May 2nd. This person is an early morning jogger who runs trails in that area several times a week as part of a regular fitness routine and who knows the area well. On May 2nd, at approximately 5:50 a.m., this jogger saw 2 men in the woods off the main trail in an area where people don't typically go, doing something with shovels. The jogger couldn't see exactly what they were doing because of intervening trees and distance, but could clearly see 2 men, 2 vehicles parked nearby on a service road that's not commonly used, and both men holding shovels and appearing to be digging or working the ground intensively. At the time, the jogger didn't think much of it or find it particularly suspicious. The jogger assumed they were doing some kind of legitimate work or project, perhaps something related to trail maintenance or land management. But after the Sullivan children were reported missing later that morning, and massive searches began in that specific area, the jogger started to wonder if what they'd seen was somehow connected. However, the jogger didn't come forward immediately to authorities, partly out of uncertainty about whether it was actually relevant, partly out of not wanting to get involved in a major criminal investigation with all the complications and potential dangers that involvement brings. But as the case progressed over months, and the jogger saw extensive media coverage about Daniel's truck being in that area at that time, about cell phone data placing Daniel there, about the intensive searches in those woods, the jogger finally decided to contact investigators and report what had been witnessed. The jogger was brought in for detailed interviews and was shown photos of various people and was asked if any looked like the men seen in the woods that morning. The jogger identified one of the men as possibly being Daniel Martel based on build and appearance. The second man, the jogger said with reasonable confidence, looked like the person in the photo of Darren Geddes. This eyewitness testimony places both Daniel and Geddes in that wooded area at the critical time, actively doing something with shovels that required both of them to be present. Combined with all the other evidence we've discussed, the cell phone records showing coordination, the cell tower data showing both were in that location, the soil on the shovel matching that area, the deleted text messages showing guilty knowledge, it creates an absolutely overwhelming case that Geddes helped Daniel dispose of the children's bodies in a deliberate effort to conceal evidence of murder. Now, before we continue with more extensive details about Geddes' imminent arrest and what it means for the future of this case, and for the pursuit of justice, let me take a comprehensive and detailed moment to remind everyone of the essential background of this tragic story. Because understanding the full context and timeline is absolutely crucial to appreciating why this new development about Geddes is so significant and potentially case-breaking. For those who might be joining this story now, or for those who need a detailed refresher on the key facts that have been established over 7 months of investigation, let me walk you through what we know with certainty about what happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan and how this case has developed from that tragic day in May. Lily Sullivan was 6 years old and Jack Sullivan was 4 years old when they disappeared on May the 2nd, 2025, from their home in Lansdowne Station, Pictou County, Nova Scotia. These were real children with real lives, real personalities, real futures that should have stretched for decades ahead of them, not just names in a case file or subject to criminal investigation or statistics in crime reports. Lily was described by her teachers at the local elementary school as bright and creative, a child who absolutely loved to draw pictures and create art projects with enthusiasm and dedication. She would spend hours with crayons and markers and colored pencils, creating colorful pictures that she would proudly show to her teachers and classmates. Pictures that now serve as heartbreaking reminders of a life cut short. She was always eager to help others in her classroom, volunteering to help teachers with tasks and offering to help classmates who were struggling with assignments. She had a kind heart and a gentle spirit that everyone who knew her recognized and appreciated. Teachers remember her smile, her willingness to share, her excitement about learning new things. Jack was described as an energetic, enthusiastic little boy who loved being outside and playing in all kinds of weather. He was fascinated by trucks and construction vehicles and could identify different types with impressive accuracy for a child his age. He would watch construction sites with rapt attention, pointing out excavators and bulldozers and dump trucks with excitement and asking questions about how they worked. He had an infectious laugh that would make everyone around him smile, a laugh that would echo through playgrounds and living rooms, a laugh that people who knew him still remember months after his disappearance and presumed death. The children lived with their mother, Malaha Brooks Murray, who was in her late 20s at the time, and her partner, Daniel Martell, who was in his early 30s, in a house on a property in the rural community of Lansdowne Station. For those unfamiliar with the geography of Nova Scotia, Pictou County is located in the northern part of mainland Nova Scotia along the Northumberland Strait, and Lansdowne Station is a particularly rural part of that county with properties spread out over considerable distances and surrounded by forests and wilderness areas. This geographic isolation becomes important to understanding how events unfolded and how Daniel and Malaha thought they could get away with what they did. This was what's called a blended family situation, a family structure that's increasingly common in modern society, but that can come with its own unique challenges and stresses, particularly when relationships are strained and resources are limited. Lily and Jack were not Daniel Martell's biological children, but were from Malaha's previous relationship with a man named Cody Sullivan, who had lost his parental rights years earlier through court proceedings due to his own serious issues and inability to provide safe care for children. Daniel and Malaha also had a baby daughter together named Meadow, who was about 1 year old at the time the events we're discussing, making a household of 5 people total living in the home. Life in the Sullivan household was far from happy or stable in the months leading up to the children's disappearance. Multiple sources paint a disturbing picture of family under tremendous stress from multiple directions simultaneously. Financial stress was overwhelming and constant, the kind of grinding poverty stress that affects every aspect of daily life and creates tension in even the strongest relationships. Daniel worked sporadically in construction and manual labor, but employment was unpredictable and unreliable, with periods of intense work followed by periods of unemployment with no income. Malaha worked part-time in retail at a local store, earning minimal income that barely covered basic necessities like food and utilities. Together, they were struggling desperately to support 5 people, including 3 children with all the expenses children bring like clothing, food, medical care, on very limited and unpredictable resources. They were behind on rent payments to their landlord, falling further behind each month with no realistic way to catch up. They were accumulating debt from credit cards and other obligations that they had no way of paying down. They were unable to afford basic necessities at times, creating stress and arguments. This financial desperation created constant, unrelenting tension and frequent intense arguments between Daniel and Malaha that neighbors could hear through walls and windows. But the problems in this household went far deeper than money. Though the financial stress certainly exacerbated all the other issues they were facing, there were serious, well-documented concerns about how the children were being treated in that home, concerns that had been raised by multiple people who interacted with the children in professional capacities. Teachers at Lily and Jack's elementary school had been noticing troubling signs for months before the disappearance, signs that made them increasingly worried about the children's welfare and safety. They saw bruises on the children that didn't have good or plausible explanations, bruises that seemed inconsistent with normal childhood injuries from playing or typical accidents. They observed behavioral changes in both children that suggested to experienced educators that the children were experiencing ongoing trauma or chronic stress at home. Lily, who had been an outgoing, engaged student who loved participating in class activities and who eagerly raised her hand to answer questions, became increasingly withdrawn and quiet over a period of several months. She stopped raising her hand to participate in class discussions. She stopped playing with other children as much during recess and lunch periods, preferring to sit alone. She became more isolated and less communicative, changes that worried teachers who had known her personality before. Jack displayed behavior problems that teachers found concerning and unusual for a child his age. He would sometimes become extremely anxious or fearful without apparent cause, reacting to situations in ways that seemed disproportionate to what was actually happening. He showed signs of being hypervigilant, constantly on alert, scanning his environment as though expecting danger, behaviors that experienced teachers recognized as potentially indicating trauma or abuse at home. One particular teacher became so concerned that she took the significant step of filing a formal report with Child Protective Services approximately 3 weeks before the children disappeared. This wasn't a decision she made lightly, as teachers understand the serious implications of filing such reports and the potential consequences for families. She documented specific observations in meticulous detail. Bruises she'd seen on Jack's arms on multiple occasions over several weeks, marks that looked like they'd been made by someone grabbing him forcefully. She documented behavioral changes in both children that worried her from a professional standpoint based on her years of experience working with children. She expressed clear, explicit concerns in her written report that the children might not be safe in their home environment, and she recommended strongly that the situation be investigated by trained social workers as soon as possible. But the child welfare system, overwhelmed and chronically understaffed as it is in virtually every jurisdiction across North America, didn't act quickly enough on this report. There was no investigation launched before May 2nd. No social worker visited the home to assess the situation and interview the children and adults. No one intervened to protect these children when they needed protection most desperately. This is a systemic failure that haunts everyone involved in retrospect, and that has raised serious questions about child welfare practices. Neighbors living in the houses near the Sullivan property had also heard concerning things in the weeks and months before the disappearance, things that in retrospect they deeply wish they had reported to authorities at the time. Multiple neighbors reported to police investigators after the disappearance, when law enforcement was conducting extensive canvassing of the entire area, that they'd heard what sounded like arguments or serious conflict coming from the Sullivan property on multiple occasions over several months. Some specifically remembered hearing what sounded like children crying or screaming in distress, followed by adult voices yelling harshly and angrily. One neighbor described hearing a child's voice screaming the word "stop" repeatedly and urgently, followed by sounds that might have been impacts, objects hitting surfaces, or walls. Sound that made this neighbor extremely uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to call authorities. But like so many people in similar situations across the country, these neighbors didn't want to interfere in what they assumed was a private family matter. They didn't want to make assumptions about what was happening based on sound they heard through walls. They convinced themselves it probably wasn't as bad as it sounded, that all families have conflicts and arguments, that it wasn't their place to get involved or call authorities and potentially cause problems. And now they live with tremendous guilt, knowing they had opportunities to potentially save these children's lives, and they didn't act on those opportunities when action could have made a difference. Daniel Martel's personal background reveals troubling patterns that suggest this wasn't his first experience with concerning behavior around children who weren't biologically his. Before his relationship with Malaha, which began approximately 3 years before the children disappeared, he'd been involved in a serious relationship with another woman who had a young daughter from a previous relationship. During that relationship, which lasted about 2 years, concerns were raised by multiple people about Daniel's interactions with the child and his approach to discipline. He was described by people who observed him as being too rough, too harsh in his discipline methods, lacking the patience and gentleness that young children require and deserve from caregivers. There was a specific documented incident where he grabbed the child forcefully enough to leave visible marks on her arm, marks that were noticed by a daycare worker. The daycare worker, following mandatory reporting protocols, reported the incident to child welfare authorities who investigated. The case was investigated by social workers who interviewed the mother, interviewed Daniel, and observed the child for signs of ongoing abuse. But ultimately no criminal charges were ever filed against Daniel. The investigation concluded, and the case was closed without further action beyond recommendations. The relationship between Daniel and that woman ended shortly after this incident occurred, and Daniel moved on to his next relationship without facing legal consequences. But the pattern was established in official records. This was someone who had a documented history of difficulty controlling his temper around children who weren't biologically his, who used excessive force in the name of discipline, who crossed boundaries that should never be crossed with children, and who had been investigated before for concerning behavior. Mala Brooks Murray also had her own concerning history as a parent, a history that raised serious questions about her ability to adequately care for children and meet their physical and emotional needs. Approximately 2 years before Lily and Jack disappeared, she had temporarily lost custody of both children. This is a significant event that speaks to serious concerns about her parenting abilities and her life circumstances at that time. The children were removed from her care by child welfare authorities and placed with Malaha's mother for a period of several months, while Malaha was required to address personal issues that made authorities question her ability to care for the children properly and safely. The specific reasons for this loss of custody are sealed in court records, as is typical in child welfare cases, which are generally kept confidential to protect the privacy of families and children involved. But family members have indicated in interviews with investigators that concerns were raised about multiple aspects of Malaha's parenting during that period. Her ability to adequately care for the children's basic needs like food and hygiene, her mental and emotional state and stability, questions about whether she was providing adequate supervision to keep them safe from harm. She eventually regained custody after several months, presumably after completing whatever requirements the court had imposed on her, whether that was counseling, parenting classes, addressing mental health issues, demonstrating stable housing and income, or other interventions designed to ensure she could parent safely. But family members privately expressed doubts and concerns about whether she was truly ready to handle the significant responsibilities and constant demands of parenting two young, energetic children who required consistent attention and care. Text messages recovered from both Daniel and Malaha's cell phones through forensic analysis reveal a relationship that was under significant and increasing strain in the months leading up to the children's disappearance. The messages paint a disturbing picture of a couple in crisis, struggling with multiple stressors and increasingly resentful of the children. They argued frequently and intensely about money and their desperate financial situation, about the children and the challenges of parenting, about their future together, and whether they even had a future worth staying together for, about feeling trapped in their circumstances with no apparent way out. Daniel expressed significant resentment in messages to his friends about having to support and care for children who weren't biologically his. Children he felt no